Hey friends, just want to welcome you today as we continue our study through Romans. Today we're going to be in Romans chapter 4. We're going to start in verse 9. And so as you look at Romans 4, verse 9, I got the opportunity one time to go and watch a military Marine Corps boot camp graduation, and I've always been intrigued and admired the discipline of the military, but it was crazy to me to see hundreds and hundreds of people marching and moving and shouting in unison. I remember at the graduation, forgive me for not knowing the names and terms, but whenever they would tell them to, about face or move, just the sound of the scrape of their boot on the concrete and everyone bringing their other foot down at the same time was incredible. It was incredibly loud, surprisingly loud, and because all of these people, they were moving in unison. They were following in unison, and it was pretty incredible to see. And the title of today's message is "Following in the Footsteps of Faith." We're going to see Paul talk about Abraham and talk about who Abraham followed and how we should follow. And so following in the footsteps of faith. And the first thing that I want you to see, right, is the curse of struggling. The curse of struggling, because just to back up before chapter 9, or verse 9 in chapter 4, Paul says to the one he talks about to the one who works in verse 4. The wages are not credited as a gift, but as an obligation. And so to the one who works, this blessedness that Paul's going to talk about, that we covered a little last week, but Paul's going to talk about this blessedness that comes in verses 7 and verse 8. To the one who works, wages and what you've earned, it's not a gift, it's an obligation. The best way that I can describe this for us is you can imagine, it's summertime, everybody's trying to get, the beach body. And so, especially if you go to the beach, you'll see a lot of people running. It seems like, we go to Florida, and every other person in Florida is running up and down the sidewalk. And runners will tell you that it's so much more fun to run outside than it is on a treadmill. Because here's the thing about a treadmill. You can run forever, right? You can run for 3 hours, and you can run as hard as you can, as fast as you can, as your ankles and your feet and your knees start to hurt. If you're not used to running, your lower back starts to hurt. Just pain, as pain comes into your body, but you push through the pain, jog through the pain, run through the pain. And you can run mile after mile and just get drenched in sweat, and you can put forth all your effort. When you want to give up, that you push yourself, you make yourself stay on that treadmill, and you keep pushing, and you keep running harder and running faster and running longer. When you get done on that thing, and you look at yourself, and it looks like you just climbed out of a swimming pool if you're like me, and your body's hurting, your knees are aching. You could have run a marathon on that treadmill. You could have put in 26.2 miles on that treadmill. But here's the thing. When you step off of that treadmill, you're going to step off of it right where you stepped on it. Even though you ran miles and miles, and you sweat and you worked hard, you didn't go anywhere. Even though you've been running as hard and as fast as you can, you've been running in place. You haven't gotten anywhere. And when we try to work for our salvation, Paul is telling us, when we're trying to work hard to gain God's favor, it's not a blessing, it's a curse. Because we can do all these things. We can be the best that we can possibly be. But at the end, when we stand before God, we've missed it, man. We haven't gone anywhere. And so Paul talks about this, the curse of struggling. To the one who works, wages are not credited as a gift, but it's an obligation. But he says, however, to the one who trusts God, who justifies the ungodly, their faith is credited as righteousness. And so, to the one who trusts, and that faith being credited as righteousness, see, that is, blessedness is salvation is not a struggle. No, my friends. Blessedness is being forgiven, having your faith. As he says in verse 7 and verse 8 of chapter 4, that blessed are those whose transgressions are forgiven, whose sins are covered. Blessed is the one in whom the Lord will never count their sin against them, right? That is salvation. That is being blessed that David talks about. And so we see the curse of struggling. And then picking up in verse 9, Paul says this, right? He says this blessedness that we were just talking about, he says, is this blessedness only for the circumcised or also for the uncircumcised? We've been saying that Abraham's faith was credited to him as righteousness. Under what circumstances was it credited? Was it after he was circumcised or before? It was not after, but before, and he received circumcision as a sign, a seal of righteousness that he had by faith while he was still uncircumcised. So then, he is the father of all who believe, but have not been circumcised, in order that righteousness may be credited to them. See, Paul asks two questions here, right? He asks, who can be called blessed, right? Who can be saved? And at what point are they blessed, or at what point are they saved? And so the second thing, right, if our first point is the curse of struggling, the second point is the circumstance of salvation. Because Paul is asking these two questions. And to understand sort of what Paul's talking about, is we need to understand that salvation is, there are three phases or three parts to being saved, right? So we have justification, who we believe that's when we are right before God. That's when we're just before God. That's when we're forgiven. That's what we would be, when we talk about being saved, that is what we're referring to. That time that you are justified by God, you're forgiven of your sin. That when God looks on you, he doesn't see a sinner that's doomed for hell, but when he looks on you, he sees you as being righteous, as you being a person that Jesus' blood is covering, and you've been cleansed. That's justification. Now the second phase is sanctification, right? It's the reason we're left here. If our sole purpose was just to be saved, to be justified before God, then why doesn't God just take us to heaven right then, right? But he leaves us here for a reason. And the second part of our salvation is sanctification. That's where we are becoming more like Christ, right? We're day after day, we're striving for that, with Peter that says, be holy as I'm holy, right? To be perfected, to be becoming sanctified, becoming more and more like Jesus every day. That's sanctification. And that process is going to last from the time that we are born again, when we're justified. This sanctification process is going to last until we close our eyes in this life, or Jesus comes back and we enter the third phase of salvation, which is being glorified. Glorification, when we are given a new body and we're in the presence of Christ in heaven. And so salvation has three parts, you understand. It's justification, sanctification, and glorification. Now what Paul is talking about is at what point are we justified, right? At what point are we justified before God? It's kind of like the age-old question, right? Which came first, the chicken or the egg? In religious circles, the talk is, will you see, is there works before you're justified, or do works follow justification? And to answer your question, the chicken came first, right? If we believe that God made a mature earth, then there's a chicken who eggs, and so on and so forth. So there you go. If you've been stuttering over that question all these years, scratching your head, not being able to move on in life, there's your answer, right? If we believe in a mature earth, then God made mature creation. So anyway, so at what point are we justified before God? And Paul answers it when he says, under what circumstances was Abraham's righteousness credited to him, right? He says, was it after circumcision or before? So was it after an act of sanctification? Or was he judged righteous before God before that sign of circumcision, before that act of sanctification or a religious act? And Paul says it was not after, but before. And because he received circumcision as a sign, a seal of righteousness that he had by faith while he was still uncircumcised. So Abraham, because you see, the Jews believed that because of their circumcision, because of their works of the law, that they were approved by God, that they were chosen by God, which they were a chosen people, but they believed that they were godly just because they had circumcision and done, had these other religious acts in their life. But Paul is breaking that down over who can be saved or who can be judged righteous before God. That it's not, a Jew versus Gentile, or even here, it's not uncircumcision versus circumcision. That it has nothing to do with those outward acts, because Abraham was justified before he was circumcised. Justification comes through faith. That when we believe, then we're justified. You see, we think that outward religious acts equal or inward righteousness, and that's simply not true. However, we'll talk about this in a minute, but inward righteousness results in outward righteous acts. But see, it wasn't a Jew versus Gentile. It wasn't a circumcision versus uncircumcision. It wasn't like churchy people versus unchurchy people. You see, because none of those things matter. It doesn't matter what you look like or what you sound like. It doesn't matter where you come from or what kind of background that you have. None of those. But what I want you to understand, the circumstance of salvation, that there are no prerequisites for us being saved. None. Some people say that you have to, do these little things, these catechisms, or you have to jump through these hoops before you're saved and you can be confirmed in the church. That's not the picture that we see here. And really, that's not the picture that we see anywhere in Scripture. There was no prerequisite for Abraham to be saved. It was simply him placing his faith in God, and then it was accredited to him as righteousness. And so, and what this means for us today is, I can't tell you how many people, and you may be one of these people, that you think, man, well, I would love to get in church, but I've been gone so long, and man, I got all these things, all these habits. I just need to clean myself up a little bit before I can start going to church. Or I know I need to get saved, but I've been living this life, and so I just need to polish some things up, right? I need to sand myself. I need to clean myself up a little bit before I come to Christ. No, my friends, that's not how it works at all. You see, there is no amount of goodness that we can achieve apart from Christ. We can't make ourselves good. We can't make ourselves right. Jesus does all of that. I mean, imagine if we treated our doctors and hospitals like that. We're feeling sick, right? Something is wrong in our body. Our body's aching. We've got, fever, and just things are going on. The Tylenol won't help. And so we think, well, let me just try. Tylenol's not working for me, so let me try something else, right? Let me try some Motrin. And let me start kicking this, Tylenol and Motrin back and forth, and let me do this and see how long, this will work. Maybe it takes me. No, we don't do that. When we're sick, we go to the doctor because the doctor is going to tell us what's wrong with us, and the doctor is going to help us feel better, right? And so why do we treat Jesus the same way? That we think we have to clean ourselves up before we come to Christ? No, my friends. We come to Jesus, and Jesus is the one that's going to do the cleaning. Jesus he's the hospital for sinners, right? Something's wrong with us. Something is broken. That thing is sin, right? We're affected by sin, and here's the thing. It's an illness and it's terminal. Sin only leads to death. But we can come to Jesus for the cure. We can come to Jesus for salvation. We can come to Jesus for life. And from there, if Jesus is the church, or if Jesus is the hospital, right, then the church is the rehabilitation center. You don't have to be perfect to go to church. Look, I've been in many churches, and I haven't found anybody in them that's perfect. Because here's the thing, a church is just people who have been saved and people who are being perfected, who are being sanctified. It's a rehabilitation center where we try to help one another. And so look, the circumstance of salvation, there are no prerequisites, right? We come to Christ, trust in Him for salvation. That's it. The only circumstance for salvation is faith, right? And for Abraham, circumcision, which is what Paul's talking about here, circumcision was just an outward sign of something that Abraham had on the inside. Circumcision was just an outward expression of an inward faith. Now, if you're a Baptist, that sounds familiar, because that's exactly how we treat baptism. That baptism is not an act of salvation, but we are baptized because we're saved. And as we say, anytime we get in the baptistry, is that baptism is just an outward sign of inward change, right? And so we see the curse of struggling, right? It's like running on that treadmill. We're working hard, but we're not getting anywhere. Now, if we want to be blessed, if we want to be saved, then the circumstance of salvation is all it costs us is faith. That we place our faith and our trust in Christ. And then the last thing that I want you to see is the consequence of sanctification. The consequence of sanctification, because back in Romans chapter 4, in the middle of verse 11, Paul says, "So then he," that's Abraham, "is the father of all who believe, but have not been circumcised, in order that righteousness might be credited to them." And verse 12 says, "And he is then also the father of the circumcised, who not only are circumcised, but who also follow in the footsteps of the faith that our father Abraham had before he was circumcised." And so the last thing, that point 3, is the consequence of sanctification. You see, we place our faith and our trust in Christ. The result of that is salvation. Following salvation, following that inward change, is going to be outward evidence, outward action, right? So the sanctification, becoming more and more like Christ, so we will clean up what we say, clean up what we do. That doesn't mean we'll be perfect, but we'll be better, right? Because from our salvation, the consequence of that is sanctification, is becoming more like Jesus. And as Paul said, following in the footsteps of faith, right? Following in the footsteps of faith. And that word follow, that actually means to walk in rank, to walk, in file, to walk in line. Like that story that I shared about the military graduation, them all moving. That's the picture, is walking in rank, walking in file, walking in sync, keeping in step with those who have come before us, so that we will live and act and speak in such a way that we'll be like Abraham, we'll be like Paul, and we'll be like some of the other Christian leaders that you may know, that essentially we are trying to walk in step with Jesus. We're trying to be just like Him. We're trying to live just like Him, talk just like Him, treat one another just like He treated people. We're trying to love one another like He loved people. It's like that old pastor who preached that sermon and made that statement that became sort of a movement for a while. Those bracelets that say, WWJD, what would Jesus do? We live our life like that. We try to be just like Jesus. It's kind of like, I didn't know, my son is a math whiz. It's incredible how quickly he picked up math. English, on the other hand, I didn't know if we were going to make it. I thought one of us might do the other one in learning how to read and write. Which, I mean, he's a genius. He's probably smarter than I am. He's 7. He's probably already smarter than I am. But But for a while, I didn't know if we were going to get there. But when he was learning to write, and even trying to teach our 3-year-old to write, they have these books where they have multiple lines, and they have the letters already drawn on the page. And then instead of like whole letters, they're just dotted letters. And then there's nothing. And so when you're trying to get a kid to write, you're teaching them, okay, this is an A. And then on those dotted A's, the kids take their pen and they go where somebody's already drawn something, right? They're tracing those letters, so that the natural progression is once they learn those movements, then they'll go down on their own and they'll write the letter themselves. And essentially that's what we're trying to do with the Christian life. We read in Scripture and we see what Jesus did and how he lived, and we look around to people who are following his example, and we try to follow their example. And then when we're on our own, they say that your character, who you really are, is who you are when you're alone, so that when we're alone, still we live and we act and speak in a way that's like Jesus and honors him. And so I have one more story about this following in footsteps that I'll share. So I read this story about this farmer who he liked to drink, but he kept it a secret, and so he kept his alcohol out in the barn. And one morning, because he would always go out in the morning, one morning, a snowy morning, he walked out of his house and he walked down to his barn like he always does, but he heard something behind him this morning, and so he turned to look, and he saw his son jumping from one of his footprints that he left in the snow. He was jumping from footprint to footprint, following in his father's steps. And so the father turned around and told the son, "What are you doing?" And the son told him, "I'm following you." And so the dad told him, he's like, "Go back to the house." And as the son went back to the house, the father went down to the barn, because the father did not want to see the son to see what he was doing. The father did not want the son to follow him into the barn, right? And what we have to understand, we have to ask ourselves 2 questions. Who are we following, and who's following us? Right? We can follow, I wish that father would have went back in the house with his son, or led him to a different place than to go down to the barn and be a bad example. So we may have bad examples in our life, and we have to decide, who do we want to be like? What kind of a life do we want to live? Because those decisions, we make those decisions every day, and one decision leads to another. As I tell you guys so much that it starts when we get out of bed in the morning. We have to decide who's the kind of person that we want to be, what kind of life do we want to live, and it's a decision that we have to make every single day. And so, who are we following? Who are we looking up to? Who are we giving permission to speak into our life? Who are we trying to mold and shape our lives to be like? My friends, there's only one answer for that, and it's Jesus. There's only one way that leads to life, and that's Jesus. Okay? And there's only one way that leads to blessing, and that's following Jesus Christ and living the way that he lived. But we also have to think, who's following us? Because in your circle of influence, your sphere of influence, as our preacher says, people are watching you. You may not even know it, and there are people following you. Where are you leading them? What kind of a life are you living? What kind of a legacy are you leaving behind you? What kind of influence, good or bad, are you leaving for the others that are watching you? My friends, we're to do as Jesus did. Love as Jesus loved. Speak as he spoke. Not just for us and our good, but also as a testimony to those who are around us. And so, my friends, just know that you're loved, that you're being prayed for. Looking forward to seeing you again in person. And until that day, you guys be safe, be well, and see you later.